This week, Ilona Cohen from HackerOne is with us to discuss the future of cyber regulations in the US. Then Jen Guile from Endor Labs joins us to talk about trends in application security. Finally, in the enterprise security news, Change Healthcare's HIPAA fine is vanishingly small. How worried should we be about the threat of AI models? What about the threat of DeepSeek and the threat of employees entering sensitive data into Gen AI prompts? And the myth of trillion-dollar cybercrime losses are still alive and well. So we'll discuss that as well. All that and more in this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy Pluto Day. Not to be confused with Pluto Demoted Day, which is August 24th. This is episode 395, recorded on Thursday, February 18th, 2025. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the acolyte of Apple, the Prince of Poutine, Guillaume Ross. How are you doing, Guillaume?
Pretty good. Just sad we're not recording yesterday because that would have been Active Directory's 25th anniversary. So we're one day late on making that the day instead of Pluto.
Wow. Yeah, I saw your note on that. And usually with things like that, you're like, wow, is it that old? But with Active Directory, when you said that, I was like, it's got to be older than that. It just seems
because
so
you're thinking
old.
of NT, but also I think working with it feels very long. So it feels like you've been stuck with it for 90 years.
Yeah. I guess it came out with Windows 2000 then, because I'm old enough to remember NT4, sadly.
Exactly.
Right. A few quick announcements here. Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their 2025 full conference pass to RSA. RSA will take place April 28th through May 1st in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC25 and use the code 5U5SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. And we'd also like to remind you to give us some feedback if you enjoyed this podcast. Subscribe, like, and comment if the platform you're on supports those things. Tell us how we can do better or suggest guests you'd like to see on the show. Oh, and that URL would be securityweekly.com/guests if you want to suggest a guest. Today's topic is the future of cyber regulation in the US. We're excited to have Ilona Cohen. My name is Sanabria, so it's very important to me. Ilona Cohen, Chief Legal and Policy Officer at HackerOne, with us today. How are you doing,
You got
Ilona?
it right. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. And you did pronounce my name right. So thank you very much.
So I got a little flustered. I didn't finish your bio, but your bio is important and relevant to the conversation. So I'm going to finish it. You joined the tech industry after serving nearly 4 years in the Obama White House, first as Special Assistant to the President and Associate White House Counsel, and then as the General Counsel of the White House Office of Management and Budget, which is why we feel so lucky to have you for this conversation, because you've got a little, some inside knowledge most of us don't have when we're being armchair experts on the internet discussing this, having hot takes on LinkedIn.
Everyone's an expert in their own mind.
Yes. But some actually know what they're talking about. So let's start back with, maybe some of that experience you had. What is it like being in that role? 4 years at the White House seems like one of those pandemic things where like real time and what it feels like are two completely different things, where, maybe it's equivalent to 15 years somewhere else, right? Seems like a very fast pace.
It is a very fast pace. It's extremely intense. You never quite know what you're going to work with on a given day. In the 4 years that I was there, I was, working on both national security as well as cybersecurity, and then at OMB, pretty much a little bit of everything. And you're dealing with, crises like Ebola to the Boston Marathon bombing, to any number of other very important, pertinent things that need immediate attention. We had a cybersecurity attack from a nation state that affected 20 million people, 20 million federal workers, and over 1 billion records. So we were constantly reacting to things, but also trying to proactively address the issues that were coming at us.
And I imagine well, I can't imagine what it's like for you reading some of the hot takes where, part of the armchair quarterbacking is we lack context for things, right? 4 years doesn't sound like a long time for an administration to change, but in those 4 years, we often forget what the process is like. So sometimes things that are normal, that are typical for the process, like, when the head of CISA stepped down, initially people were kind of, freaking out, reading into things. And, other people with longer memories were saying, no, this is totally normal. This happens every time there's a switch in administration. This is a political appointee. How much of that are you seeing out there versus takes that are actually correct?
Yeah, I mean, I know that when I left the administration in January of 2017, as a political appointee, that was an understood expectation. We all submitted our resignations, and it was understood that we would leave when the president left because we served at the pleasure of the president. So, the fact that Jen Easterly left CISA is not really any surprise. She was a political appointee as well, and it was normal for her to tender her resignation at the end of the last president's administration.
Yeah. And I think one of the frustrations is that it can be somewhat disruptive. When some of these people leave and they're not done with something that they're working on. So that,
Sure.
the dissolution of all the DHS committees, which included CSRB, like a lot of people just hyper focused on CSRB, but it was kind of like a blanket thing where all the committees were disbanded. And they were in the middle of a Salt Typhoon investigation, which, according to the news, they're still in our telecoms and going strong. So, I imagine that's where some of the consternation comes from, some of the frustration.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a multitude of ways that a government can do an investigation into something like Salt Typhoon, where there's the National Security Council, and what the National Security Council might do in the White House might be out of the eyes of the public, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Obviously, I'm not in the administration. I can't say what's happening there, but just because they disbanded one committee doesn't mean that all oversight or all review has since been disbanded. I mean, I don't know. I certainly hope not.
Yeah. So there wasn't a new cybersecurity director named, a new national cybersecurity director at the very beginning of the administration, but they're doing that now. So that was one of my concerns, is I hadn't heard much about cybersecurity from this administration, but it does look like they're getting to it. So maybe, talk to us a little bit about the process here, and maybe what an executive order is in the first place. Because I think when we see a lot of these headlines, there's not a little subheading below that says, remember, an EO is not a law, right?
Right. Well, okay. So first, let me just challenge for a second that there's no focus on cybersecurity, or you're not hearing much on cybersecurity, because you can say as much. You can do something with respect to cybersecurity by not acting. And in some ways, that's what this administration did, because the very last act of the Biden administration was to issue a cyber executive order. And I'll tell you in a second what an executive order is. But the fact that they did not repeal that cyber executive order, even when all of these other executive orders from the Biden administration were repealed, I think says a lot. So what is an executive order? It's basically a directive by which the president will manage the federal government. So you're right that it doesn't have the same impact as law. What the president is telling agencies is that they need to do a particular thing. And it doesn't always have the effect of law. A lot of times there has to be a rule-making process that follows, but that's what that is. So when the president repealed when this president repealed the AI executive order, for example, everybody was paying a lot of attention and thought that that was a huge deal. But the reality is, it was, in my view, much ado about nothing, because what that executive order had done was to direct the agencies in his administration to take actions that had already been taken. So the fact that he repealed it didn't make that much of a difference. It was really just for show in some ways. The real impact is what follows from that executive order. So the fact that President Biden issued the cyber executive order and President Trump did not repeal it, I think says a lot about the importance of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think there's some issues there that are probably bipartisan as well. There's a lot of around the identity, and zero knowledge proves that someone who lives in this state is of that age. And I know there's a lot of interest around proving that you're not a minor when you visit certain websites and so on. That doesn't sound like. So it sounds like there's some useful content for both sides of the aisle there. So I wouldn't be that surprised if it didn't get completely repealed, right?
Yeah, right. And I mean, it's possible they could repeal some portions of it and reissue it under their own name. Maybe they want, it to be a Trump executive order because they think it'll have more of an impact. It doesn't really matter who issues the focus of that cyber executive order was dealing with nation states, China, specifically, right? The very first paragraph talks about the PRC and how important it is to address the risk posed to the U.S. government by the different, campaigns essentially targeted at the U.S. government. So whether that is, policy implemented by the last administration or the new one, it's okay. It doesn't make a difference. The most important thing is that cybersecurity has primarily been a nonpartisan issue, and there's no reason to believe that it won't stay that way.
So, if we talk about, maybe some of the more permanent regulation here, given, the administration has, we can presume the full backing of the House and Senate on most things, especially if these things are bipartisan. We can expect any regulation to go through pretty easily. I mean, but part of the platform was maybe less regulation, more focus on business growth. Can you maybe talk about what we can expect to see in the next 4 years with respect to regulation in general, like the actual laws that get made?
They've said they wanted to take a lighter regulatory approach to AI, that they want to, remove any barriers to innovation. And I think that that's in part to, make sure that America has a place as the dominant AI creator. But at the same time, they do recognize that there's an important place for AI red teaming, making sure that there's public trust in AI and in the validation of those systems. I don't think they're going to be as focused on bias or discrimination or unintended output in AI, but there will be regulation to make sure that AI is safe and secure. So the safety, the security focus, I think, will remain, and that there would be regulation around that, or maybe the Congress would even act.
And I imagine as much, if not more so, now that the DeepSeek gauntlet has been thrown down and China has entered the fight here, the battle for AI innovation.
Yeah, I think it's only an accelerator to make sure that we have security front of mind when we're using these AI systems.
Or it might actually go the other way around, which is we need to innovate much faster so they don't get ahead because they don't have the same security concerns than we do. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, no matter what, regardless of which administration was coming in, we're already going to see less regulation, in part because of the Supreme Court's decision last term to eliminate what's called Chevron deference. Now, this is me getting super nerdy, and I'm going to try to make it not so legalistic. But basically what that did is it it removed from the federal agencies the authority to issue regulations and have the courts rely on their interpretation of the law. And so, no matter what, we were going to see many more challenges to regulations in the courts, and especially with respect to AI, because the agencies, in order to issue any regulations on AI, would have to essentially interpret laws that never even contemplated AI, let alone some of the technological advances that we've seen in the last several decades. So we were going to see sort of a pushback on regulation no matter what. It just was a matter of which form.
And do you think we could even see some, maybe some rollback of regulation? I know when we were chatting earlier, we talked a little bit about the SEC's new rules.
Yeah, I do think that. And that's another area where I think, regardless of who won the election, there was going to be a pushback on those SEC rules. When we were chatting, I was telling you about the SolarWinds case, and that got a ton of attention. Obviously, CISOs were on high alert after the CISO for SolarWinds was prosecuted personally, and the case was dismissed in part because the judge said that the SEC never had the authority actually to regulate in this area. So the area in which they took their authority was for accounting controls, sort of to regulate accounting controls. And the judge, despite the fact that the agency has relied on that authority for decades, the judge was like, no, accounting is not security. You don't have any rights here. And so I think you're going to see pushback in that space anyway, right? Because when you open the door, the floodgates, are let in. So you're going to see pushback on those SEC rules in a variety of different forms.
Yeah, that's interesting because we do have a lot of laws on the books that are sometimes used to prosecute cybercrime and things related to breaches and things like that are somewhat antiquated and, a bit of a stretch, like, crossing state lines and wiretapping laws. And even the CFAA is pretty long in the tooth at this point.
Yeah, there are some of those laws really do need to be updated. But in the interim, agencies have to do something in certain respects in order to try to sort of standardize the approach to security. And so they use old statutes to try to achieve outcomes that are relevant to today.
So, what are people most misunderstanding with some of these cases? We've seen. I want to say his name was Tim Brown, something like that. The SolarWinds CEO. I might be getting it wrong, but and then Joe Sullivan. Yeah. What are how are we maybe help us correct our perspective here on some of these things based on the commentary you've actually seen in the public.
Well, I think that those are two really different cases. The problem
Right.
is that they came at or around the same time. And so CISOs rightfully got nervous that meant that there was more liability for them. And, look, I'm not a prosecutor and I can't dictate what the government will do. But, the Joe Sullivan case was very clearly about what he did or didn't say to the government when they were investigating him. So that's a circumstance that, not everybody might find themselves in. And then as I mentioned, the SolarWinds CISO case, very different, and also one that I think the SEC will think twice about bringing again in light of the potential and very real challenge to its authority. Like, they don't want to lose that authority. So they're going to be very careful now about what cases they bring, and they're going to want to hope to settle, I would guess, the cases that are brought.
Yeah. So just some contextual information. Guillaume is Canadian, but in some ways knows more about what's going on here than I do. I feel like I'm always getting an education on almost a day-to-day basis on some of this. Like
I'm part of the continuous onslaught of news coming at you. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Are you the type that like sends every, article or like
Not
tweet?
every, but to be honest, in terms of security, like putting aside, all the, stuff happening right now, let's just say, pointing at everything.
Yeah.
In Canada, we very often wait to see what happens in the US. And so, therefore, any laws that are made around cybersecurity, AI, and so on, it would be very unlikely to see innovation come from here, considering most of what we use is made in the US anyway. And usually things, come to us from the US. So, for example, those executive orders and Canada never really talked about things like S-bombs until it was a thing in the US, and everything was like S-bomb this, S-bomb that. So we're heavily incentivized to know what's going on over there, and a lot of it might come here, right? Like we don't have the SEC, we have equivalents. We don't have as many tech companies, so we haven't seen it really play out. But then there's also other things like DMCA exemptions and everything that relates to like trade and export of things like exploits and information about vulnerabilities. It's always a little bit more complicated when you're, air quote, international. So that's why we have to stay up to date. And, I almost always work for US companies anyway. So kind of embedded in that world.
Yeah, I always get to hear about all the quirks in employment law when Guillaume is trying to get onboarded into a U.S. company as the first and only Canadian employee.
Yes, I'm sure. As a lawyer, I understand the complication. Yeah, well, so what I think probably Canada will still be able to adopt from the US is the focus on critical infrastructure. I don't think that is going anywhere. And it's one where all of us are aligned. We have to make sure that we protect critical infrastructure and the industrial base from all of the, various cyber criminals. So that will affect Canada as well. But it really is something that, like I said, is not a partisan issue and will be hopefully a primary focus of the cyber platform in this administration.
We have some pretty good advantages in terms of critical infrastructure, especially around energy, like electricity, right? Like I'm in Quebec, we have one provider, they're gigantic. And in terms of cybersecurity, they are probably better than 99% of the smaller operators. That being said, it's all centralized. So if something does happen, the potential impact is much bigger. So it's going to be probably similar controls and similar rules, but applied very differently when it's a massive company with hundreds of thousands that are serving 9 million houses versus smaller utilities.
Yeah.
So we'll see that. And then like on the banking side, it's very similar. Where if you take, I don't know what the 8 biggest banks in the country, you're essentially covering everyone. We don't have regional banks really. So we probably have more centralized risk, a little bit more control, but more centralized, and it's going to be worse if something happens. So keep an eye out.
Yeah, and I think that will continue to be a focus. It will have to be a focus in the US. The last National Cybersecurity Action Plan that President Biden issued did focus on sort of leveling the playing field among these industries, and in particular critical infrastructure, because there's a huge difference between, as we've seen, health. I heard you're talking about Change Healthcare later, right? The way that the healthcare industry has adopted, certain best practices is very different than the way that the banking industry has adopted certain cybersecurity best practices. One is a leader and one is a laggard. And so we're going to have to do something to level that playing field. If they're not going to do it by regulation, maybe that's out of favor now. They're going to have to do it some other way.
Personally, I was interested in seeing what would happen with Salt Typhoon and the CSRB, because over here, we don't know where Canadian telcos impacted. Probably, I don't think there's a lot of proof saying that they were, but I was really hoping that through a more thorough investigation, we'd learn, or there would be some side channel information that would allow us to know that for sure. I think it's quite unlikely that we wouldn't have been targeted, because same thing, right? Like there's only a few companies and it's serving everyone, but we just don't have that information. So I was really hopeful we'd get some of that. Do you think we'll get some of the information that relates to like telecoms being targeted at some point in the next maybe couple years?
Like I said, I'm not in the administration. I couldn't tell
Oh,
you.
I'm just asking you to guess,
No, no.
guesstimation,
I was going
educated
to
guess.
say that they're just because they've closed down one avenue for communication doesn't mean that they've closed down all avenues for communication. And I would guess that there are ways that Intel can communicate with Intel if there is a foreign adversary who is actively targeting. So I would assume that there are still conversations happening and information flowing between the countries.
Yeah. So hope maybe the
Whether
public
you
doesn't
and
know
I
yet.
will know it, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think it's probably good reason to keep using encrypted messaging when we're using these telcos.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I have to say we work for certain government agencies in the US, and one of the things that we do for them is we help them find and fix vulnerabilities before they are exploited by criminals or these nation states. We run these, CVD or, continuous vulnerability programs. And so that is a best practice that I hope all governments will start using. Not all of them do. So that would be one way where that you could, just seek to prevent some of these exploitations.
Yeah, it was kind of a watershed moment. I remember the whole hack the Pentagon thing, and it was kind of a shock to us because like we were still trying to convince private industry to do it, and all of a sudden the government jumped in both feet. And
well, that was actually following that cybersecurity incident that I said at the beginning that I told you about in 2015. The Office of Personnel Management was hacked and 20 million federal employees were affected and 1 billion records. And, I was in the White House at the time and they, the president was just like, you have a blue sky. What do you want to do on cybersecurity? And I remember being in a room when somebody said, let's do a government bug bounty program. And I said, what's that? Right? Because nobody really knew what it was, or at least I didn't. And that's what ultimately ended up being the HackerOne and, Defense Department Hack the Pentagon program, which is now in its 9th year and has identified more than 50,000 vulnerabilities. So.
I think that was when a lot of policy people learned of bug bounties and a lot of us learned of OPM.
Yes.
And the type of data that was there, right? Like I talked to a lot of different friends who said, oh, I interviewed there. I worked at the CIA. They're the people who might be storing answers to like a polygraph before being hired. And you think that's probably the worst thing to ever have,
my SF-86 was in there. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm pretending to know what a SF-86 is, but that sounds bad.
It's basically your application for government where you have to disclose everything. Like anytime you've ever smoked pot, it's all in there.
Yeah.
Well, but nowadays bug bounties are, I think, publicly accepted. People know about them, and it's not very controversial when you suggest to a company or government organization that they should have a bug bounty. Maybe they won't have the money for it, but
you're right about that. Well, actually, we offer a free vulnerability disclosure policy on our website at HackerOne.com. But we also, it's worth noting, not every industry has fully accepted it as a best practice. Like I said, the Goldman Sachs of the world or the Citibanks, those are the leaders, and the financial services industry has followed suit. But I actually just wrote an article about how the healthcare system has really failed to get on board.
Yeah.
And part of that issue is actually because they are so worried that if somebody discovers a vulnerability and they come across PHI, that the company is going to have to report that as a breach. Right?
They're using HIPAA to argue that they shouldn't do security testing because it will expose medical data.
Right. But at the same time, losing a ton of personal health information anyway in all of these breaches. So, I would rather have an ethical hacker accidentally come across some of my information than, the entirety of it going out the door. So I did write an article and I explaining that I hope this is a catalyst for change. Like this, in the White House, they always say never waste a crisis. And the idea there is like you can once things hit rock bottom, you really can you have the impetus to actually make changes. And here is one that is desperate for change.
Yeah, I remember when Mark Andreessen, he's got that software is going to eat the world quote, and he revisited it a decade after he first said that, just to see if he was correct or not, or to talk about what's happened in the last 10 years. And his conclusion was, yes, I was correct, except healthcare. And he threw in an exception for healthcare there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's true. Like some of these organizations, if you're barely keeping the lights on, you're probably not ready to invite a bunch of people to run in with a hammer and start breaking stuff. So, but we got to get them there. Like that is critical infrastructure.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And there's actually a bill in Congress right now that extends. The federal government actually issued a regulation or issued an executive order in the Trump administration that mandates VDP's vulnerability disclosure for every federal agency. And there's a bill pending in Congress that would extend it to all government contractors. And the value in that is you can't protect one without also protecting the other. They're two inextricably linked. And so it's the same with with critical infrastructure. If you really want to protect it, you really have to extend some of these best practices to the multitude of companies that are essential and that make up the critical infrastructure network. You just can't let them be off on their own doing whatever they want, because the end result is you're not going to get the security that you need.
Well said. And after we stop recording here, I will get that link, or I'll go out and find the blog post and include that in the show notes so people can go check that out.
Oh, thanks so much.
But thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk AppSec trends with Jen Guile from HackerOne. No, she's not from HackerOne. You're from HackerOne. She's from Indoor Labs.